This is Eric Pepke for Dead Man Video. This video contains graphic violence and nudity and is not suitable for repugnocrats. There are many really fine YouTube videos ranking Frank Zappa's albums. This, of course, is a completely impossible task. I love how each one is different, reflecting the focus of the author. This video is pure pretense for the purposes of pompous pontification and other things beginning with P. If that isn't for you, go watch an important message. Everyone will be happy, and politics will take care of itself. Number 10 is them or us. Politics is always about them or us, but who are we and who are they? It's not about political parties, nor is it about sexual orientation, nor is it about skin color. Let's face it, at the planet of my dreams gives the answer. It's about principle. The Constitution isn't perfect, but nearly all of its protections have been destroyed in the name of expedience. It doesn't matter if a threat is real or imagined, true or false. Freedom-loving Americans are only too happy to throw constitutional protections away and pass ignorant judgment when angry or afraid. This album is merely number 10 because there is no point in talking about principles to the overwhelming majority who do not have them. They'll cheer and immediately go back to flipping out at what the holy box tells them. The only way is to stick to your principles, but frame your communication according to the principles of cognitive science. Number 9 is Freak Out, a superb political album with Hungry Freak's Daddy, Help I'm a Rock, and Who Are the Brain Police, which is even more relevant today given the subsequent invention of qualified immunity. You're probably wondering why I'm here. Could be my theme song, but because I'm still going after being imprisoned for politics, I chose In This Moment's Big Bad Wolf instead. Freak Out is only number 9 through no fault of Zappa's own. If it came out today, it would be as fresh and exciting as back then, but back then was more than a half century ago, and it's now perceived as a relic of the civil rights era. Era implies that it's over, which unfortunately it probably is. We don't remember it as the Black Civil Rights Matter era, even though it was much more focused on the problems of black people than whatever movement we don't have today. White and black people protested together and died and were buried together. Trouble Every Day was about the Watts riots, but the Rodney King riots were 3 times as extensive, and we've sort of lost count today. Number 8 is Thingfish. Now, overall, I found this album disappointing, but it does have its moments. I downloaded Harry as a Boy on my prison MP3 player just so I could fantasize about using an Ike Willis sample. Political prisoners don't have much technology, so let's see how it works in my real voice. Why, easy there, white folks. Maybe that would have been better if the lack of prison dentistry had not deprived me of my teeth. The business model of all U.S. news media is to convince white people it can never happen to them. That's because if you spook the spooks, they won't give to the NPR pledge drive for a CD with an hour and a half of tube and throat singing. They won't buy adult diapers advertised on CNN. They won't buy prayer blankets advertised on Fox. Al Sharpton's robot camera gives me motion sickness, so I never got a feel for what MSNBC advertises, but I imagine they could sell an awful lot of strap-ons. I love Black Lives Matter for pursuing just justice. But the free poltroons of the press who are gobsmacked, I say, when white people show up because this only ever happens to black people. Why, easy there, white folks. Not so much. Number 7 is You Are What You Is. This has so much great political stuff in it, it's a shame to rank it as low as number 7. You're probably wondering why it's here, and so am I. The fact is, as Zappa said about Civilization Phase 3, I feel I have to hurry. I'll be technically out of federal custody in about 2 weeks, and this is not a good thing. I have no family, and all my friends abandoned me when I was imprisoned. I filed an income tax return to get my belated stimulus, but apparently somebody's trying to steal my identity, so that's going to be delayed, and the IRS isn't answering the phone. I also had problems getting a replacement Social Security card, which the prison was supposed to give me, but didn't. These problems may be related to the identity theft. I don't know. Maybe I can pull a rabbit out of the hat and avoid dying on the streets as an insulin-dependent diabetic, but there's another problem. In 1984 and 1985, the federal government got rid of its parole system and replaced it with supervised release, which works like parole, except it's after you're supposed to be free. The duration is wholly arbitrary, and mine is for a lifetime. During that time, they can order you to do or not do anything they like under pain of re-imprisonment. One ex-prisoner, a friend of mine, has been told not ever to search the web. Another has been told he couldn't even address Prison Family Anonymous, where his wife goes for support, or do anything remotely related to activism. I might get lucky and be allowed to make more videos, but I can't count of it, so I'm trying to do as much as I can now. If I am able, I'll tell you all about it with history and such, but since nobody seems to have cared for 3.5 decades, I doubt that'll do any good. Number 6 is We're Only in It for the Money. This album seems very 60s, but it satirized the hippies. The hippies have long since discovered cocaine and tax-free municipal bonds and switched from liberal to classical liberal, so it isn't that serious a distraction. The album speaks of police brutality and concentration camps for dissidents. There was also metapolitics when the album was heavily censored. Let's Make the Water Turn Black contains the line, "And I still remember Mama with her apron at her pad, feeding all the boys at Ed's Cafe." Some raving bureaucrat got the idea that she was feeding sanitary napkins to the customers. This shows the kind of mind we're dealing with. Still, it was only a few cuts to a record, but things got a lot worse later, and we'll be revisiting the 60s again. Number 5 is Broadway the Hard Way. Coinciding with Zappa's run for president, this was a heavily political album. But most figures are remembered poorly, if at all, or got work after Felix the Cat. The face of feminism has changed for the better, and AIDS has been obscured by COVID, which has killed a lot more people in a much shorter time, and is also a bit harder to turn into a moralistic issue. Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk is relevant and prescient. Pat Robertson never really had a chance, even though he sent me a tape to try to get my support. I didn't take Jim and Tammy Faye Baker all that seriously at the time. I never could really groove with the kind of people he bilked. I do have to admit his taste wasn't all that shabby, even though I prefer them a little bit older. And I could kind of see his point. Besides, dogs are more human than people, so why not give them an air-conditioned doghouse? But there is a dangerous darkness when people like this do get into power. Weighing in at number 4 is Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention. The most political song is Porn Wars, which I find interesting for 3 reasons. First, it may be the only time in history that moribund Senate proceedings have been turned into high and complex art. Second is how the proceedings violated, subverted, and circumscribed the law. If the ladies really didn't have time to listen to rock records to protect their children, the obvious solution would be to let the church do it. But of course that had nothing to do with what it was about. After Reagan got off scot-free for Iran-Contra, politicians decided they could get away with anything they wanted, including nepotism. What is remarkable here is the focus on only rock music and Satan, Satan, Satan. At first, the hippies were all into vaguely Eastern mysticism, which they didn't understand at all. But as they metastasized, they got into born-again Christianity, which they didn't understand at all either. Many capitalized on this change in the zeitgeist, including rock musicians that had always represented adolescent rebellion against the values of their elders. Sexual repression in the 1950s, political repression in the 1960s, good music in the 1970s, and a bizarre perversion of Christianity in the 1980s. Doubtless the hippies realized their childish naivete as described in Turning Again. But they couldn't be honest about it and so looked for a substitute. But they were quite capable of projecting on others, too. And so every preschool in the country became a hotbed of satanic activity with hidden secret tunnels to lead children out for ritual sacrifices to Satan. Thus another holy trinity for those with authority: sex, violence, and children. You get 3 guesses what comes next, and the first 2 don't count. Number 3 is Joe's Garage. Now, I am a complete dystopia maven. In the prison library, astonishingly, was Zamyatin Zwi, which set the stage for all future dystopias. Most people are familiar with Orwell's 1984. While I admit it has some good bits, it has some problems, such as the idea that you need torture to enforce obeisance. For one thing, rats are really quite cuddly. Still, torture serves a valuable recreational function. Since the 1990s, the government has had an effective dopamine blocker which saves on cleaning bills. Still, the jail where I was physically tortured probably didn't have access, so they used older methods instead. Ashcraft was only kept awake for 36 hours, which as a software developer, I doubt I would have noticed, especially in combination with what my paralegal agreed was a written death threat. But after a year, I was able to think and feel again. Still, I may have some brain damage because I'm risking being re-imprisoned to fight for the civil rights of people who do not want any. But that's probably safe because nothing I say could possibly make any difference. Brave New World always seemed to me much more realistic because people choose their own oppression. Most adaptations seem to take it as a straight morality play, the noble savage against an evil mechanized society. That never sat well with me. It was, after all, the savage who non-consensually beat up his girlfriend. The crazy citizens expressed their Dionysian impulses in a much more healthy way. In prison, I read an introduction by Huxley that confirms he meant the irony, pitting a mad society against a lunatic one. Joe's Garage gets all the notes right. Not only does Watermelon and Easter Hay accurately reflect the experience of dying in prison, but a literally technophilic society going crazy over a terrible new menace seems about right. You might object if the government gave you a device to track your every movement, so you carry one around with you instead. Number 2 is absolutely free. Here comes the big one. So far, things have been pretty funny, but there is absolutely nothing laughable about the City Hall mind. This should be a matter for psychiatry, but powerful people like the way they are and so project their pathologies onto innocent people and destroy them. And that's the way America likes it. I kind of figured that out already. It's a popular fact that all those hippie protests were protected by the First Amendment. Like most popular facts, it's wrong. To see why, we have to look at some history. I warned you, didn't I? The Constitution was intended to limit the powers of government, but governments, of course, don't like that. So they immediately gutted the First Amendment with the Alien Sedition Acts. Thomas Jefferson, who was a real liberal and a real conservative, well, sorta, kinda, maybe, didn't like federal limitations on free speech. So he refused to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts, but they remained on the books. About the only agreement about the World War is that nobody agrees on why it happened, even though it was popular enough for a sequel. Everyone agrees that Americans must be avenged by any means necessary. Woodrow Wilson and Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Some people didn't like the draft, so they published pamphlets that were mild by 60s standards. They didn't advise draft evasion, but only asked people to think about it. Of course, the government put them in prison. The First Amendment just didn't apply to a clear and present danger to undermine war efforts by sedition, or to an intent to undermine war efforts by any means, or if anybody thought there might be such an intent. By 1960, no danger at all was necessary to imprison people for reading books the government didn't like. This made everything a whole lot easier, and red, white, and blue-blooded Americans responded in the usual way. Eventually, some popular people needed free speech, so the Supreme Court gave citizens the right to criticize the government. To protect your rights, it is essential to defend people you despise. There are very few people who have these values, but the majority knows what it wants. Deprived of the ability to be honest about political imprisonment, the government had to turn to a pretense. The old standby was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, introduced as part of a campaign to stop evil raping Mexicans. The taxes were really quite reasonable, but the penalties for any misstep were so draconian it was scarcely, if ever, collected. Most Americans didn't know that marijuana was just the Spanish word for cannabis, which had been used in medical preparations for many decades. It was sold as an evil new drug, and the ruse worked splendidly. But also in 1969, the Supreme Court declared the Marijuana Tax Act unconstitutional. Nixon promptly responded with the War on Drugs and the Controlled Substance Act, and America was great again. In 2005, the Supreme Court affirmed the Controlled Substances Act, so stop saying marijuana is legal anywhere in the United States. I myself petitioned the Supreme Court to overturn Gonzales v. Rake, but as Supreme Court review is a matter of discretion, I doubt they even read it. Still, as states come to realize that legalizing marijuana is good for public safety and the economy, something's got to give. Fortunately, the government has a plan to make America great again. I call it the retro Jim Crow. The Sun magazine gives free subscriptions to prisoners. I read an article by Alex S. Vitale. It described a technique FBI agents Chad Lloyd and Joshua Cribbs had used on me 6 times. A lack of training is not the problem. So I wrote him with my ideas, and he read a copy of my letter to his class. He also sent me a free copy of his book. On page 133, I found a quote straight from the horse's part, which confirmed everything. Whenever you jump on the bandwagon over the latest horrible atrocity, you help your government use unconstitutionally overbroad and vague laws to destroy innocent people. Yeah, right. Number 1 is Phil Maurice, June 1971. Now, there's not much political in this album, but on the back cover is the most important political message you'll ever see. Especially if you care about what I or Zappa have said, don't forget to register to vote.